At night, in the mountains covered with mist, a barefoot boy with long hair, Ash in a robe, dashed through the forest. His clothes were ripped and he was frightened. He didn't notice a root and tripped over it. The boy lost his balance and tumbled down a steep hill. He lifted himself from the ground with his right hand and swore. It felt to him that the energy beneath his feet was fading. Ash looked up, now resting on both hands, and swore again. The boy stood tall. He saw many figures in cloaks before him, and sadly understood that they had planned everything from the start. Ash gritted his teeth in frustration. One of his foes, perched on the highest branch of a tree, remarked that Prince Ash had arrived here in 30 minutes. His companions chuckled and said they had barely waited for the hero. The boy stared at the bare swords of his enemies and didn't know what to do. He had no strength left. He boldly and firmly asked those hunting him why, since he hadn't even had a chance to become king and planned to abandon living in the palace. Ash didn't grasp why they wanted to kill him. The hooded man's eyes glinted cruelly. He said it didn't matter whether the prince wished to stay in the palace or had a magical talent from birth. The assassin believed Ash should have known this. He rested the sword on his shoulder and added that since the hero also had a claim to the throne, this was just a required step. His ally suggested that the hero not fight back. Ash's enemies' further words stunned him. They promised that, despite his low-born blood, the killers would consider that he was the king's son and would end him painlessly. The boy was deeply hurt by the phrase about low-born blood. He scowled and grew angry that they dared to insult his mother. The prince pulled a dagger from his robe, realizing his foes would hardly end him gently, so he decided that if he was fated to die, he would battle to the end. The man facing him wasn't surprised at all, assuming that Brooke's guard had taught Ash fighting skills. However, seeing the hero's clumsy stance with a weapon, he changed his mind and decided that blood is blood. The killer kept watching his prey. He thought the hero wasn't a warrior but simply refused to surrender and found it even more amusing this way. 4 men in cloaks, on the orders of the 5th, attacked the prince. Ash began to swing his dagger, his enemy prepared to hit. He knocked the dagger from the hero's hand with a strike to the palm. The boy looked in terror at the weapon he dropped. The killer reached for him, grabbed the hero by the neck, and lifted him into the air. The hooded man stared at his prey and couldn't believe this was the end. The boy pulled another dagger from his belt at his back. The comrade of the one holding Ash by the neck tried to warn him but only distracted him. While the killer wasn't looking, the boy thrust the blade into his throat. The dead man's partners perked up. The boy landed as his foe choked on blood. The prince rubbed his neck, grinned, and agreed it was amusing. The killers didn't understand what was happening or how someone who hadn't studied fighting could kill one of them. They began to wonder if he was pretending or really didn't know how to fight. One of them readied his weapon. He scolded the dead man for acting so carelessly in such a situation, and feared what would happen if the boy truly learned fighting skills. The killer, holding a sword, rushed at Ash, yelling. He jumped and struck the hero hard in the jaw with his knee. The boy fell and began coughing blood. His foe was furious at him for daring to kill his comrade. Then the man drove the blade into the prince's chest. The hero screamed throughout the forest. He lay on the ground, writhing in agony. The killer stepped on his stomach and asked what it felt like to have a hole there. The prince screamed, clutching the ground with his fingers, and was upset that he only fooled one. Then, however, the boy thought it was good that he killed at least one. The killer kept pressing on his wound, causing terrible pain. He wanted Ash to die slowly and feel all this suffering. The prince screamed. The sadist's comrade watched from the side. He didn't like this method at all, but admitted that since their member was dead, there was no other way. A sudden flash occurred. The killer broke out in a cold sweat and widened his eyes. The next moment, his partner, who had been mocking the hero, was destroyed by an explosion. He was blown away from the boy by the blast. No one else was harmed. Ash looked ahead at the bloody enemy. The killers stared blankly at the body and didn't understand what this white light was. A man in sneakers stepped onto the field. One of the men noticed this, turned, and pointed at the source of the threat. The killers looked at the new figure who had an incredible presence. This man sparkled with lightning. The killers didn't dare approach him. He stood confidently, dressed in modern clothes, arms crossed over his chest. The killer frowned and sweated, unsure who this was or what he wore. This man, smiling, lowered his hands. The killer couldn't stand it, drew his sword, and attacked, asking who he was. The boy in front of him didn't move, still smiling. Another flash occurred. The attacking assassin was torn to pieces before his surviving comrades. One of the two remaining was shocked when he felt his partner's blood splash on him. The boy before them glowed with lightning even brighter. The cloaked men didn't grasp what it was or how their foe vanished so quickly, leaving a strong gust of wind. One assumed it was the lightning step skill, but couldn't believe it. He realized that instantly everything around him vanished and became clear like water. The next moment his boss was killed, and the only living assassin screamed when he saw it. The man tried to figure out what kind of light he saw. He thought in horror that it was the light of a warrior whose skills had reached the highest level. The killer noticed this light again and wondered why such a great fighter was helping this boy. He held the weapon with both hands, trembling. The hooded man looked at Ash, who had lost much blood, and decided he couldn't be saved, meaning they had completed their mission. He dashed from the spot to escape and retreat. The killer leaped into the air, away from the enemies. The man with lightning pointed his hand at him. The killer seemed to burst and dropped his weapon. The prince watched, grinned, and said again that it was amusing. Then he slowly closed his eyes. The man who killed all the enemies was surprised that his ancestor was smiling even in death. The prince opened his eyes again, hearing about the ancestor, wondering who this man was and what he meant. The hero saw everything as if in a fog. His eyes were closing, so he couldn't tell who stood before him. The prince felt his body growing cold. Ash was breathing heavily, staring at the sky, believing this was death. The man in front of him checked his wristwatch, realized he'd been found, and cursed. He pulled a device from his back and admitted he wanted to arrive earlier and give him instructions on using it. The man looked at the prince lying on the ground and decided he needed to hurry before he died. He was about to inject the syringe into Ash, who could only watch with his eyes. The man then injected the syringe's contents into his ancestor's chest and noticed he even felt sick. He raised his hand with the medical tool, smiled, and said he was done. The man in modern clothes leaned over the bleeding ancestor, intending to tell him something. He wished Ash good luck and hinted that he also wanted something good from the prince. The man stood tall, hid his hands in his pockets, and loudly explained that this nano-machine was the newest invention, so it wouldn't be hard to use it. He wished him luck in learning it, then vanished, leaving Ash alone. The prince didn't understand what this strange being was trying to say. A mechanical voice sounded, announcing the 10-digit number of the invention. Ash's eyes widened in shock. He thought he heard odd noises in his head. The mechanical voice added that the 7th-generation nanomachine of Sky Corporation had been put into operation. Long ago, the warriors of the Celestial Empire created a fighting art to defend themselves. Over time, it grew from a way of self-protection into a way of life. Now it is a detailed system that includes ways of eating, breathing, spiritual growth, and much more. Warriors passed their wisdom to the next generations through special scrolls and holy books, which, over time, began to look like a complete teaching. Compared to common people, those who mastered the art of war, called Muram, had truly amazing powers. One day, young students joined together, wanting to quickly gain more strength and knowledge that their elders held. The elders did not want to share these too soon, and as a result, the Muram society split into betrayers and loyalists. Unable to defeat each other, a fragile balance was kept between them for a very long time until a completely different third group appeared. They were called magicians, and their teachings were known as magic. This is the story of someone who aimed to overthrow the Lord of Magic and become the new Lord himself. This is the story of Prince Ash. The hero woke up. He quickly got out of bed, recalling everything. Ash looked at his hands and was shocked that he was alive because he remembered a sword had definitely been thrust into his stomach. He rubbed his forehead and wondered what had happened and why he was all wet. Then he began to feel ill, and the boy covered his mouth with his hand. The hero noticed that his hand was covered in black spots for some reason. The prince checked himself, smelled a toxic odor, and felt the stickiness of his body. A robotic voice asked the user if he was awake. Ash didn't understand what it was and looked up from examining himself. The nanomachine repeated its question. The boy got scared, jumped out of bed, and started searching for the source of the voice. He looked around the room but realized no one was there. The nanomachine asked the user to calm down. The prince thought it was an inner voice but decided it was unlikely. The hero had only heard it once in his life, and it sounded different. Ash thought deeply, as the voice seemed to come straight from his mind. The boy was in no rush to move. He concluded that the voice was really in his head. The nanomachine confirmed his thoughts, and Ash was stunned. The prince clenched his fists and loudly asked who he was speaking to. The robotic voice introduced itself as the 7th-generation Sky Compression nanomachine. which had made a direct link with the nerve center of Ash's brain. The hero closed his eyes and shouted that he did not understand what it was talking about. He asked to be told plainly who it was. The boy, standing with his back to the open window, listened as the robotic voice repeated that it was a seventh-generation machine. The prince thought it called itself a manhwa. He frowned when he realized that if it was a spirit, it was the kind of being that could be gained by understanding the magical sacred fire. The hero fell to his knees, raised his head, and asked if he was really talking to a spirit. The nanomachine stayed silent. The man met the white advisor and invited him to follow. The advisor, an old wise man, asked if this was truly an attempt at a secret attack. James, who was walking beside him, confirmed this idea. James tensed up, gritted his teeth, and noted that this was far from the first case in recent times. He added that, until yesterday, their foes did not dare to act so boldly. The advisor put his hand to his beard and guessed that, since they had chosen such boldness, they were likely from a magical group in the north. He concluded that the Lord's choice to let them live was a mistake after all. The two of them walked on. James said it was clear that someone had helped young Master Ash, but it was impossible to figure out who exactly. The white advisor was surprised as he thought that with his rank, he could try to guess. Sweat appeared on James's face from thinking about it. Yesterday, he had been shocked. What he saw then was indescribably terrible. On the cold ground before him lay pieces of bodies, torn in half, scattered in different directions. James found that only one of the attackers was lucky to be unharmed. The knife that the man had given the young master was sticking out of his neck. Suddenly, James heard someone breathing. Not far from him lay a body almost fully covered in blood. It was Prince Ash, but when the man checked his body, something surprised him. The advisor touched his beard and assumed there were no wounds on him. James said that was true. On the way, he said that the hero's breathing was steady, as if he was sleeping, and that his clothes had clear marks of a sword strike, but the body itself was clean without a single scratch. The white advisor closed his eyes and wondered who had helped the prince, considering that the heads of the other groups would not join in such a small fight. James thought so too. He was carrying a small bag in his hand. The advisor laughed and admitted that it was very curious. He decided to look at the young gentleman himself first. Meanwhile, Ash was kneeling in his room asking an inner voice if it had saved him. The nanomachine replied that if he was talking about the enemies who threatened him, then the answer was no. It noted, however, that it had fixed his body, preventing a deadly result. The prince didn't fully understand what a deadly result meant. The nanomachine was quiet for a moment, and then said that the user's mind should contain information about this. However, the boy became even sadder since he did not know the meaning of the word user. The robotic voice announced that it was searching for a more fitting word for this time. After a while, the nanomachine explained that it was not the creature the master called a spirit. The hero was shocked when he realized that his speaker's way of talking had changed. He asked who it was, then, if not a spirit. Ash continued to sit on the floor during the talk. The robotic voice warned that it was going to send basic information and instructions for use into the prince's brain, and asked if he agreed. The boy didn't understand most of it but agreed. Then lightning surrounded him, and streams of information began to flow into his mind. The prince was stunned. He suddenly realized he felt sick and covered his mouth with his hands. Then he vomited right on the floor. The nanomachine said that this always happens during the first transfer of information, and noted that there should be no dizziness or sickness in the future. The hero sat with his back to the bed, put his hand on his face, and complained about feeling bad, not understanding what was happening. He opened one eye and spoke to the nanomachine, which quickly responded to the master's call. Ash looked at the black spots on his hand and asked if this meant there were currently a huge number of very tiny machines in his body. The voice confirmed this and explained that, at the moment, almost 6.5 trillion nanomachines were evenly spread in the prince's body. Ash mentally sighed since he could not grasp what it was, as it was neither a person nor a spirit. The boy sitting facing the door of the room asked if the nanomachine could accidentally leave his body if it wanted. The robotic voice pointed to the sent information and said that its program allowed it to fully leave the master's body only in the event of his final death. Ash sat in the lotus position. He concluded that this was the mysterious stranger who had dealt with those northern mages who had placed that very nanomachine into his body. The hero looked at the floor, not understanding why this had happened to him. He wanted to ask who had put the nanomachine into his body, But he didn't have time. James knocked on the young gentleman's door and announced that the white advisor had arrived. The boy jumped up in surprise and asked what was now inside him to stay quiet for a while. He understood that if someone saw him talking to some device in his head, they would surely think he had gone mad. Ash lay back down in bed. The nanomachine said it could communicate with the master through thoughts, simply by reading brain waves. The hero whispered that he understood everything and asked the device to be silent. It said it was briefly switching to sleep mode. James walked inside with the advisor and noticed that the young master seemed to be still awake, so they should be careful. However, he didn't have time to finish his thought and rushed to the hero's bed, finding that he had woken up. James was very worried about the boy and asked if he was okay. Then he winced and covered his face with his hand. The man smelled a bad odor and asked what it was. Ash realized he had completely forgotten about it. The white advisor scratched his beard. He was curious. The advisor approached the young master's bed and asked if he remembered the old man. The prince confirmed and noted that he could not afford to forget the white advisor who had answered the call and come to treat his mother. The advisor extended his hand and asked to let him check the hero's heartbeat. The boy became worried about it. The old man assured him it was nothing serious and urged him to give his hand. Ash offered his hand with clear black marks, and the white advisor began to feel the pulse. The advisor was shocked. He said it was simply incredible. James became nervous and shouted a question about what the old man was talking about. He began to think the worst, that the young master had some kind of illness. The advisor let go of Ash's hand and noted that it was just the opposite. He admitted that he did not understand the hero's condition at all. James asked what he meant. The old man, as usual, put his hand to his beard and suggested that all the poisons had left the prince's body, and his pulse had become healthier than ever. He thought the hero had taken some kind of miracle cure. Ash turned his head to the old man. He did not understand what the white advisor was talking about and asked for an explanation. The advisor, standing by the bed, explained that he was saying the young master's body was in the best shape for mastering the art. The boy was shocked. He realized that the sticky black stuff all over his body was the waste that had come out of him. The hero examined himself while lying down. He was amazed that all of this was done by a nanomachine. The device thought it was called and asked if the master wanted to turn off sleep mode. The boy allowed it to be done and sleep mode was quickly turned off. Ash felt as if lightning had passed through his whole body. The robotic voice explained that the nanomachines in the master's body removed all the harmful poisons present and adjusted the blood and muscle system so they were best suited for sports. The prince swallowed, still not understanding what he was dealing with. He raised an eyebrow doubtfully and mentally asked the device if it was sure it was not a spirit. It answered the master that it was not a spirit, but a nanomachine. Although the magic cult was formed from many clans and families, there were only 6 primary clans among them: Sword, Darkness, Stream, Poison, Sound, and Blade. The Lord took a vow that he would wed a woman from each main clan so that they would produce an heir. The successors were born and raised according to custom. When they reached a certain age, they were admitted into the Magic Academy. This academy opens its gates every 10 years. It was established to train the finest warriors of the generation, and it is led by the top expert of the magistrate. Once upon a time, there was a period of unusually fierce rivalry. Then several princes entered the academy at once. It was called the time of battles of the heirs of the magistrate. Ash asked the entity inside him if he was certain he wasn't an evil god. The mechanism told the master that he was a machine, not an evil god. The boy completely forgot that he was in bed. He turned away from Weiss, recalling that he was from the Poison clan, which meant he shouldn't reveal that he had a nanomachine. However, the mechanical voice warned that the technology of this era would not be able to detect its presence. The wise advisor thought about it. He was sure that someone had aided the protagonist. The old man concluded that the prince's body was healthy, but he was still going to prescribe a tonic to help restore strength. James thanked the doctor with great delight. James noticed Weiss heading for the door with the intent of leaving and expressed a wish to see him off. The old man replied that it was not necessary and asked him to stay with the prince. The wise advisor left the building and thought about it. It seemed very odd to him how a person could change so much. Long ago, when Ash was still a child, Weiss was certain that they would simply dispose of him, given his frail body and lack of skill in martial arts. Now, considering the state of his health, the old man believed that the protagonist had more potential to learn the arts than other princes. The doctor turned around the house. He remembered that Ash was still the illegitimate son of the Lord, But he also admitted that the boy was merely pretending to be unconcerned about all this while at the same time he was actively exploring everything. The wise advisor clasped his hands behind his back. He decided that if the Lord secretly assisted him, then in that case he simply did not need to publicize it. The old man concluded that the newly opened academy would be lively. The prince, lying in bed, sighed in relief since he did not think Weiss understood anything. He looked at James and admitted that he was alive also thanks to his guard. The protagonist looked at the man's back. He realized that, even though the nanomachine had healed him, things would have been entirely different if James had not arrived in time. Ash stood up and wanted to thank the guard, but he held out an open hand and apologized. James pinched his nose, looked away, and suggested that the young master should bathe first. The protagonist recalled his odor again and agreed with the man. The protagonist climbed into the tub. He adjusted his hair with his hand and mentally spoke to the nanomachine, which immediately answered. Ash placed his hand on the side of the tub and reminded that, before this, the mechanism said that his body was in a state of self-repair. He wondered what kind of injuries could be fixed. The mechanical voice replied that all internal and external damage caused by an outside source could be mended. The boy grew bored when the nanomachine explained that blood loss or decapitation would take longer, as it required cell growth. He complained that the mechanism kept saying things that were very hard to grasp. Ash looked at his hand and hoped that nothing bad would happen if he tested it a little. He then picked up the knife and brought it to his palm. The protagonist cut his hand and flinched in pain. The nanomachine announced the activation of a self-healing state in his left palm from the knife wound. The prince looked at his recently injured palm in amazement. The cut had already healed, only a little blood remained. After that, the guy found that it had stopped too. Ash abruptly slid into the water, splashing it around him. The protagonist sank into the water up to his nose. He admitted to himself that seeing it with his own eyes, it was hard to believe, but now he knew how it worked. Continuing to sit like that in the bathhouse, the protagonist asked the nanomachine if it was true that he would be able to use all the functions described in the information that it had previously sent to his head. The mechanism confirmed that its owner was able to use everything specified in the instructions. The guy was pleased with this answer. He decided to test them after the bath. Ash came out of the tub and could not help but notice his splendid body. The prince wrapped himself in a towel and dried himself with another. He looked at himself and thought that this did not make any sense. He did not understand how his body could be so strong and fit. The guy believed that the nanomachine did this too, and he was not mistaken, since the mechanism really did reshape his body. An old maid came and said that she was here to dress Ash. The protagonist tore himself away from his thoughts about muscle reshaping and allowed the old woman to begin. The nanomachine noted that, although science knows that it is impossible to create something from nothing, there is nothing difficult in reshaping an existing body part. The prince spread his arms to the sides while the maid tied his belt. The guy listened to the mechanism and realized that this choice of words was beyond his comprehension. He admitted that, when he listened to the nanomachine, he had the impression that everything he had learned before was completely useless. Although he tried very hard to learn, the protagonist thought about it and asked the mechanism for permission to call him Nano instead of his long name. Nano immediately registered the new name. The prince sadly noted that he was not fun to be around as he came to his office and began to think about what to do. His inner voice suggested that he find a book and browse through the pages. The guy stood in front of the cabinet and clarified whether it was true that he only needed to browse through it. Nano confirmed it. Ash took one of the books from the shelf. He thought that the only books here that were at least somewhat related to martial arts were about blood points and Kai, as well as the teaching of the 3 Jesum, a breathing technique aimed at training the body and mind. But unfortunately, even studying all your life, it is very difficult to reach even the lowest level. The prince decided in this case, it would be better to read about blood points. Ash opened the cover and told Nano that he was starting. The mechanism said that it was ready. Then the protagonist began to quickly flip the pages. He felt like he was gaining a large amount of knowledge. The guy closed the book he flipped through without missing a page. Nano politely informed that he had successfully scanned the book blood flow and asked for permission to attempt to transfer the information into the user's brain. Ash put the book on the table. He thought about the meaning of the word scan and realized that Nano meant that he copied this information. The mechanism confirmed and repeated the request for consent. The prince agreed. Many lightning bolts formed around him, which was an unpleasant experience. Then the protagonist felt like he was absorbing streams of information from the book and shouted. The textbook was back on the table on which Ash placed his sparkling hands. He breathed heavily and covered his mouth with his hand. Nano promised that he would soon get used to it. The prince removed his hand from his mouth. He asked if the mechanism cared about him. The nano machine replied that it was simply a program effect. The boy concluded that Nano was emotionless and had no feelings at all. He sat down at the table and asked what he should do now. The mechanical voice replied that if the master wanted to apply the knowledge he had gained, he should simply think about a certain topic for it to appear. The prince rested his cheek on his hand and thought about the blood spots. He began to explain that blood points play an important role in the blood flow of the human body and can also be simply called blood. He knew that there are two types of points, one that paralyzes and one that can kill, and what will definitely happen if you poke the paralysis point in the human body. Ash abruptly opened his eyes as the realization came to him. The protagonist laughed, not understanding how this was possible. He considered it wild because it was not just memorization. On the contrary, he could fully grasp the content. Nano surprised the master by explaining that he transferred the information after correcting the errors in the book. Ash was curious about what these errors were and what was written incorrectly. The mechanism said that, according to the information stored in the program, he corrected the mistake about blood points. The guy smiled dreamily and confidently. He could not believe that he could now study and master martial arts faster than anyone else. He smiled wider and his lips trembled. The prince knew that the candidates of the 6 clans had been studying many techniques since they could walk. The protagonist walked outside. Even watching the other princes, he still couldn't understand the 3 Jesm method. He clenched his hands into fists because he had heard that there were many of them in the Magic Academy. Ash bent his arm at the elbow and raised his fist, deciding that with this ability he would become stronger faster than anyone in the academy. He vowed to make this his goal. Meanwhile, in the successor candidate's quarters in the southern castle of the demon cult, the pagan house, the long-haired boy turned to the wall. He said that he sent everyone to get rid of one boy, so he couldn't believe that all 5 of them were dead. He laughed at the speaker's words behind his back, deciding that it didn't make any sense. The speaker raised his head and assumed that someone secretly helped Ash, calling Prince Jack by name. The heir was very angry since the killer had no right to call him by name at his own whim. The speaker had to apologize. He lowered his head to the floor again. Jack looked away. He was annoyed since he thought that, since Ash was a bastard with low-class blood, it would be easy to kill him. However, it turned out that he had a few advantages. Jack frowned and thought angrily that he even tried to get rid of that guard. Now he believed that there was someone else protecting the protagonist. Jack thought that this person could be his father. The guy slowly raised his hand. He clenched it into a fist, and with an expression of anger and a smile on his face, decided that he would have to kill Ash already at the Magic Academy. The sun was rising over the hero's estate. The prince was lying in bed, hands behind his head. He looked thoughtful and couldn't sleep at night due to nerves. The boy opened the window, noticing it was already morning. He looked outside and said he would be entering the academy today. In the yard, Ash saw James training with a dagger. The bodyguard was practicing combat skills bare to the waist. The hero lay on the windowsill and wondered if it would be better if he learned James's dagger technique, but he quickly dismissed the idea. He confidently looked ahead and decided that the people watching them wouldn't just leave it alone. When his mother died, Ash swore he wouldn't learn martial arts until he entered the academy. Suddenly, Nano spoke to him, interrupting his thoughts. While the prince watched the bodyguard, the device offered to scan James's movements. The hero couldn't help but be amazed. Ash asked if Nano could scan other people's actions, and it confirmed it. The boy thought about the chance of the device copying James's bodyguard training and transferring it to his mind. Nano explained it was possible. It also said that besides this, the program had many skills of other martial arts it could share with the master. It said it could even share this knowledge now. Ash was stunned. He looked at the bodyguard and couldn't decide if it was okay to borrow James's technique without his consent. The hero kept watching the training. He thought that after lunch, he should head to the academy without regrets. The boy decided he didn't have time to think about how to protect himself, so he asked Nano to scan James. The movement scan started. The bodyguard kept sharpening his skills. Ash stared at him closely, studying his new abilities. The bodyguard swung the dagger and lunged. The prince kept observing. He was still looking out the window. Nano told him the scan took about half an hour, and the copying of the movements was done. The hero winced in pain in his head as the transfer of information to his brain began. He sat on the floor by the window. The transfer was complete, and Ash noticed it was easier this time than yesterday. The hero realized something but didn't understand how it could be. He laughed, thinking how this was possible. The prince rushed from the window, then grabbed the sheath. He began to pull out the weapon. The boy thought he now also had the skill of James's bodyguard's dagger. The hero looked at the open window and remembered he had to be careful so James didn't notice, so he shut the shutters. Then Ash got into a fighting stance and relaxed. He opened his eyes suddenly. The ground crumbled. The prince made quick motions with the dagger in his hand. He stopped in a lunge and was amazed because he managed to do almost the same as James's bodyguard after 20 years of training. Ash looked at his hand, trying to believe the scan let him skip things like daily practice, holding a pose and refining movements. The boy didn't understand everything, so Nano explained that when the motion scanning was activated, muscle contraction analysis was also done. It also asked the master for permission to send information to the muscles. The hero didn't know this needed to be done too. He felt a sharp pain in his head. The device didn't have time to warn him what would happen if he didn't accept the terms. Ash dropped the dagger and fell to his knees, yelling in pain. His whole body was suddenly twisted with pain, so he asked Nano what was happening to him. The hero, trembling, tried to stand up from the floor. The device answered that, with long-term training, the body builds certain muscles needed for specific movements, but the master's body wasn't developed enough for this. That's why Ash's muscles were harmed. The prince knew he was doing something like a transfer, but was upset that Nano was explaining everything in such a complex way. The boy finally sat back on the bed with difficulty. The device reported it simplified the language to match the user's level. Ash felt insulted after these words. He grabbed his heart with a shaking hand. Nano announced the end of the simplification and said the master hadn't trained as long as James, and even if his brain had learned the information, his body couldn't adjust. It added that Ash's muscles needed stimulation, so the movements would become natural for the body, and only after the information was transferred would he be able to fully use these movements. The boy, sitting and looking at the closed windows, admitted it was much easier than before, but it was still hard for him to understand. Nano suggested lowering the language level to the simplest. Ash, annoyed, repeated he almost understood everything. The hero was breathing heavily and his face was covered in sweat. He asked if the pain would stop if he did the transfer to the muscles. The device confirmed this and asked if the prince wanted to start the transfer. Ash stood up from the bed. Nano warned that this transfer needed every nanomachine in the master's body to work, so the process would take a couple of hours. The hero thought that if it only lasted 2 hours, there would be some time left before leaving, so he allowed it to begin. Nano added that this transfer would cause pain, so the master would be under anesthesia for some time. Ash was worried it would hurt a lot. The device reported there were 350,000 recorded cases of passing out caused by transfer to muscles. The prince clenched his robe with his fingers since he wasn't sure he could handle it. He slumped his shoulders. Nano noticed the master wanted to try without anesthesia. The hero asked if he could switch to anesthesia if he couldn't handle it. Then, suddenly, he felt unbearable pain. The prince clenched his teeth and screamed. Nano announced the use of anesthesia. The hero sighed in relief, then fell on the bed. James was cooking in the kitchen at that time. He tried the dish and liked it. The man thought he was as good as the nearby masters. He kept chopping vegetables, wondering if he should cook something special today. The bodyguard decided to stick with cooking the usual meals the prince liked. He remembered fondly that it had been 5 years since he learned to cook for Ash. In the past, James wasn't even a good cook before her death. The hero's mother asked the bodyguard to look after her son. James returned to cooking. He noticed it had been 5 years since Lady Nora died from poisoned food. Today, Prince Ash was going to enter the academy, so the bodyguard silently asked Nora to grant her son protection from the sky so he could survive and enjoy food again. James heard the hero scream. The bodyguard dropped his cleaver. He burst into the prince's room and asked if he was okay. The prince was lying on the bed. James didn't understand what was wrong with him. He checked the boy's pulse. The man thought, judging by the hero's pulse, which he felt, everything was fine. The bodyguard tried to figure out what he did to cause this. He saw marks burned into the wooden floor. James touched one of them. The man was kneeling in front of the marks. He concluded that Prince Ash had been watching his training for at least 2 years. The bodyguard smiled. He was shocked that the boy had only been watching him for 2 years and had already achieved what he had after 20 years of training. The protagonist's eyes grew larger. Nano stated that the requested shift to the muscle fibers was finished and halted the anesthesia. The boy rose and took a quick breath. He was struggling to regain his air. Ash rubbed himself and resolved to never try that again. The mechanism noted that it had merely cautioned the master beforehand. The protagonist saw that he was resting on the bed and guessed that James had arrived. He got off it and grabbed the dagger. The prince stood tall. He believed that it should be easy to use the dagger technique now. The nanomachine confirmed that due to the transfer to the muscles, the master had the same fiber makeup as folks who had been practicing the needed movements for 20 years. Ash shut his eyes and focused. He moved into a fighting pose and held the knife forward. Then he made a strong thrust. The boy realized that in this thrust he used the same methods as before, but the power and precision had improved. The protagonist was thrilled. He thought that this sensation when he sliced the air was great. Ash then performed many practice swings. He threw the weapon and spun it in the air. The boy caught the knife with a backward grip and made a strike. He decided that this was all that was required for the first stage. The prince stepped forward for the second stage. He bent low and stomped loudly on the floor, causing dust to rise in the room. The protagonist was shocked. Ash looked at the damaged part and remarked that this was unfortunate. Even though he did not use the light style, he still left traces. The prince knelt down to the smoking mark from his foot and mentioned that he had already learned the heavy style. He didn't want his bodyguard James to notice this. While the boy was sitting on the floor, James called to him that his breakfast was prepared. The protagonist leaped up from the floor. He was anxious, not knowing what to do because the marks did not vanish even when he pushed on them. The bodyguard opened the door slightly with a tray in his hand. Ash shifted the table and said that he was very hungry today. James was surprised because usually the young master ate by the window. The boy pointed to the table and clarified that, since he would be away for a long time, he wanted to eat a snack in the middle of the room. He smiled nervously, hoping that James did not see the marks. The protagonist looked at the tray and saw fried bok choy with pork and an egg on top of rice. These were his favorite foods. The protagonist was ready to weep. He understood that James cared about him, and since today was the day he joined the academy, this could be the last meal that the bodyguard made for him. Ash was annoyed by Nano's sudden remark, which warned that a quick change in emotions causes the release of acid into the throat. It added that saliva creation had increased and suggested swallowing food with saliva to lower the acidity level. The prince told the nanomachine to stop speaking nonsense and stay quiet. The mechanism briefly switched to silent mode. The protagonist began to eat the food, planning to consume everything completely. James smiled quietly. The boy continued to quickly toss food into his mouth. The bodyguard asked him to eat slowly, or his stomach might get upset. Ash followed his advice. After a while, he set down his chopsticks and announced that it was a wonderful breakfast, praising James. The bodyguard seemed to have chosen to ask something. He closed his eyes and asked when the young master had learned his dagger technique. The prince became nervous. He asked James what he meant. The man moved the table. Ash was stunned. The mark from his foot was now visible. James looked at it and realized that it was left by the first move into the second stage of his technique. The mark was much clearer than the one he had seen before, and this convinced the bodyguard that his eyes had not tricked him. The prince felt hopeless because taking someone else's martial arts technique was forbidden in Mirum. He had committed a crime by using Nano to take someone else's technique, and he had nothing to defend himself with, even if James disliked him. However, the bodyguard sat beside him, smiled, and praised the boy for how he had performed. The man assured him that there was nothing wrong with the young master training in secret because he was his bodyguard. He admitted that, if not for the oath given to the 6 clans, he would have taught this earlier. The protagonist cried from such kind words. James handed him a paper, and when asked what it was, he explained that it was an energy use method for the light style of the dagger technique. The prince did not understand why the bodyguard was giving it to him. James looked the boy in the eyes and said that he wanted to offer some tips on how to master the light style. However, he believed that there would be many better things at the academy than what he could provide, so he asked him to learn it. Ash took the note in his hands and dropped a tear on it. He could not hold back his tears any longer. James tactfully stayed silent. He recalled how the young master had promised him at his mother's deathbed that he would never cry again. That was the last time he wept. The bodyguard took the tray with empty plates, He noticed that 5 years had passed since Lady Nora had died. During that time, the man had gritted his teeth and tolerated the prince's behavior, but he was still a boy who needed care. The bodyguard walked toward the exit. James stopped in front of the door. Without turning to Ash, he said that he would not be able to stay with him after his enrollment in the academy and allowed him to cry today. The man finally suggested that he stay strong from now on. The boy lowered his head and, without stopping crying, thanked James. The door closed from the other side. The prince wiped away his tears. He swallowed and decided that from today on he could not allow himself to fear or doubt. While the bodyguard returned to the kitchen, Ash concluded for himself that, even if his mother was gone, he still had a place to return to. There were many people at the gates of the academy during the day. The applicants lined up in the square. They began to chat and discuss whether all the clans were gathered and how many folks had come here. According to their rough guesses, there were about 1,000. The boy in the purple headband admitted that now that he was standing at the academy, he started to feel nervous. His neighbor with the gray headband explained that, since this was a contest among the heirs as part of a minor clan, they were forced to line up. Finally, the one who would greet the contenders appeared. He noticed with annoyance that the people who had arrived were very loud. A man with maroon hair stepped out to the crowd and angrily declared that the place was such a mess that he could not see any sign of their spirits and called everyone fools. This man was burning with anger. He was outraged that the contenders had come here without proper resolve, knowing that this could be the place of their death. His name was Ben, and he was the left bodyguard with the title of Fire King. A strong wind rose in the square. The people in the crowd recognized the left bodyguard by his red hair. They knew that Ben was one of the 10 strongest of the magic cult, or even 5. The man grinned and was surprised to see kids in the front row. He assumed that these 6 were the heirs of the 6 clans. The boy in the dark robe represented the Dark Clan. He was number 1, and his name was Claude. The Sword Clan sent a clever-looking boy who received number 2, Jeffrey. For some reason, Jack was very annoyed by the others. He was the heir of the Creek Clan and had number 3. The Poison Clan was represented by the quiet boy, number 4, Romeo. The honor of the Blade Clan was defended by number 5, a boy with a warm cloak, Alex. The Sound Clan put forward the only female heir among the main clans, number 6, Maria. Ben was about to move on to number 7, but surprisingly, he was nowhere to be found. Ash frowned and couldn't grasp why his name badge was absent. The man handing them out raised his hands and stated that he didn't see the 7th prince's badge. He added that the boy would have to wait until he located it. The hero was not very happy when he realized that this was the act of one of the 6 clans because they didn't want him to stand in the same line with them. He told the distributor that he understood everything and agreed to wait. The hero leaned against the wall while the others got their badges. He decided that nothing good would come of arguing with them from the beginning. Ash lowered his head, recalling that these were the same folks who tried to kill him at every chance. He figured that they would finish him off as soon as they saw him. There were still many people present in the square, after all. The boy had come to the academy after numerous shameful attempts by princes, and so he was going to become stronger than anyone else in this demon academy. The candidates stood in neat rows. Ash looked at the entire huge line and admitted that it would be tough to get to the front. The crowd mocked him because he had a black badge with the number 7 on it. This meant that he was an heir candidate who did not belong to any of the 6 clans. People discussed the rumors that Ash did not know any fighting styles and believed that because of this, he would be the first to fail. The hero made an upset face and crossed his arms. He understood what they were whispering even if he could not hear them. He decided to just let the others laugh at him. Ben noticed the hero standing in the distance and thought it was funny to see him at the very end. The left guard smiled and decided that this unwanted child of the Lord had chosen a strange way to gain notice. The sound of a horn was heard. The crowd gathered in the square heard it and perked up. This sound meant that those whom everyone was waiting for would soon arrive. Upon seeing the Lord, the candidates stopped talking. The sound of footsteps became audible. 4 more figures were coming out to the people. The crowd seemed to forget how to breathe while they were looking at them. In front walked a man with a small beard and mustache. He was followed by a man in a mask and a man with a sword. The Lord walked up the steps to the throne. The man with the sword tripped and accidentally hit Ben in the shoulder. Ben realized with annoyance that this drunk had come in worn-out clothes. Hank, the right guard, held a bottle of alcohol in his hand. He really didn't like the fact that the left guard was staring at him. When the masked man turned around and glared at the two of them, they fell silent. Sam, the head bodyguard, had long gray hair. He ordered Hank and Ben to be quiet. The Lord sat on the throne and placed his hands on the armrests. This man had an incredible aura of a ruler. He was also Al, one of the 5 strongest in the Meram cult, and his name was Solomon. The candidates immediately felt pressure from him. In the ranks, someone complained that Solomon's presence was so heavy that he could not lift his head. However, the people decided that this was fitting for the Lord. Ash thought that this man was his father. Sam waved his hand and gave the order to keep silence. The crowd immediately froze. The head bodyguard bowed to the Lord and said that everything was ready. Solomon stood up. He looked at the crowd seriously. The Lord began to emit a purple glow. He declared that all the candidates here were responsible for the future of this cult and greeted them. The voice was so clear that the candidates were scared. They felt Kai for the first time. The hero also tensed up. He noticed that Solomon's voice sounded like he was just speaking, but it was very clear and distinct. The Lord shouted to the crowd that, in this place, the teachings and bonds become the strength of the cult. The candidates raised their fists in the air and shouted in support. Solomon's bodyguards bowed, and Sam praised the Lord for his fine work. The people were inspired and ready to fight for the sake of the demonic cult. Solomon, however, did not show any feeling. He glanced to the side. There behind everyone, the man noticed the prince. Their eyes met for a moment, then the Lord turned away. The hero did not look away. His father was gone, and the boy seemed upset. The hero met him for the first time, and all he got was his cold eyes. He raised his head proudly, as he had not expected anything since this man had not shown up even after his mother had died. Then Ben announced that, now that the master's welcoming speech was over, they could begin. Some of the candidates continued to chat, ignoring him. The left bodyguard ground his teeth in anger. He shouted at the frightened crowd for not standing properly. Ben was furious, and it was almost physical. He looked at the offenders, noted that standing properly was not that hard, and urged them to listen carefully. Ben crossed his arms over his chest and explained that training at the academy would last 4 years and consist of 6 stages, after each of which the guys would have a test and only one chance to pass it. The candidates began to worry when they heard about one chance. They realized that if they could not complete the task on the first try, they would fail. The left bodyguard grinned when he realized that his words had reached the audience. He confirmed that whoever did not pass would be removed immediately. One guy raised his hand and said that he had a question. This man was the confident Jeffrey. Ben looked at him, paused, and then became angry because no one allowed such a strange person to ask questions. Jeffrey was shocked. He got mad, thinking that he had not heard Ben. Ben flared even more. He wondered if the heir of the Sword Clan really had a problem with him calling him a strange person, and added that everyone present should have known that, from the moment they were enrolled in the academy, they would lose all the privileges of the 6 clans. The left bodyguard furiously asked if Jeffrey really wanted to be removed before the competition even began. Claude and Jack could hardly contain their laughter. Jeffrey felt ashamed. He bowed to Ben and apologized. The man put his hand on his hip and noted that what the guy wanted to ask was obvious. The candidates listened attentively and excitedly. Ben knew that they thought that one chance for 6 stages was unfair, but he promised that whoever advanced to the next stage would receive a special prize. The left bodyguard said that the first prize was the Black Dragon Stone. Ash did not know what it was, so he listened to the guys in front of him discussing it. They said that if it was the same Black Dragon Stone, then it was most likely a healing stone that allowed the one who used it to gain 20 years, comparable to Kai. The guy in yellow asked if this meant that if you passed all the stages and earned 6 stones, you could gain 120 years. He thought that would be similar to the level of high skill. The man in gray replied that in this case, it was not so because according to rumors, the more the stone is used, the less effective it becomes. Also, it is difficult to absorb it all at once. The hero looked desperate. He had to go through 6 stages, but he currently had no Kai. However, he thought that if he passed, he would be able to increase it several times. Then Ben spread his hands and said that the second prize was a book of fighting secrets. He noted that all candidates knew fighting arts, so they should understand the importance of such books. The man added that the library of the Demon Academy was located on 5 floors, and each time the guys passed the test, they got access to 1 floor. Ben explained that, depending on the efforts made, students would have the chance to study the secrets of the 6 clans and even gain access to secret manuals on different fighting arts. His neighbor added that then it would be possible to become one of the Meram masters. Ash became more serious. He decided that, in terms of survival, books on fighting arts were more important than Kai. Then Ben pointed out with a sly expression that most of those present would not make it to the fifth floor, even if they were brought back to life, so he urged them to stop dreaming about it. In the complete silence, Hank took a drink from his flask. He pulled himself away from the liquor and thought that when it came to preaching and quickly after discouragement, Ben was the best. He personally did not enjoy any of it. The left bodyguard was ready to proceed to the third and final motivation. The candidates were curious because he declared that this was that they would be able to gain a title they did not have before. Jeffrey glanced behind him. Now he realized why they did not have titles and benefits here, and that everything would change after joining the academy, where from now on only the toughest would survive. Ben shut his eyes and waved his arms. He said that each time they passed a level, they would receive a title: low warrior title for the first level, middle title for the second, high title for the third, team captain title for the fourth level, and clan chief for the fifth. The man chose to skip the sixth level, which he did not think the candidates would need to face. He cautioned that most of the students would not even pass 3 levels. Hank looked away. Inside, he doubted that the sixth level could be called a challenge since it was nearly impossible to pass. In the centuries that the academy had existed, not even a dozen people had succeeded in this challenge. Ben added that if the candidates could pass the high levels, their title would be considered. He said that everyone would start with the title of cadet, but later they would vary. Ash frowned intensely. If survival had been his main worry before, now survival meant climbing in title. The man breathed out, placed his hand on the hilt of his sword, and concluded that he was done explaining. He announced with a grin that everyone would now split into groups to move into dorms, and then the first challenge would begin. The protagonist didn't know how to react at all. When the guy came to his senses, he was in shock. The people around him couldn't believe their ears that the first challenge was about to start. They thought it was unfair. The candidates continued to murmur, not understanding how they could already have their first challenge. They thought they had to learn something first, and were already thinking about what they would do if they were kicked out. Ben demanded that they be silent. He thrust his hand forward and repeated that those who failed the challenge would be expelled, since they did not even deserve to be called low-ranking warriors. Ash cursed in frustration, then shook his head, remembering that they needed people to do simple work, so he asked him not to try too hard. The protagonist clenched his fists tightly. Now he understood why the people of the 6 clans made him swear that he would not learn Kai. The guy was ready to give up, because if he did not pass now, he would become part of the lowest clan of the cult. If that happened, anyone would try to kill him. Jack meanwhile laughed. He looked back at Ash with a smile. Jack did not know whose idea it was to require such a skill, but he admitted that it was a good one because it would save him from having to kill the fool himself. Something caught his attention. A woman in a beautiful robe walked in front of the candidates accompanied by assistants. She held a stringed musical instrument in her hands. She was the leader of one of the 5 oldest clans of the demon cult of the Sound Clan, Hannah. The woman climbed the stairs to the bodyguards. Ben pointed at her and announced that this person, Hannah, would oversee the first challenge. He spread his arms and honestly admitted that this challenge was very simple. The man, however, warned that if the candidates failed here, they would never be able to become even a low-ranking warrior. The people looked at the leader of the Sound Clan and wondered what challenge required her presence. They came to some conclusion and covered their ears with their hands. Ash did not understand why they did this, then laughed and pointed out that if the 5th elder were to actually release her waves of musical power, they, the young ones, would not have a chance to resist. He urged the people not to worry, as she would have everything under control, adding that if they were lucky, they could endure it even without Kai. Ash cursed inwardly when he realized that they were about to face a wave of musical power. Hannah began to release energy. She said that even with a small amount of Kai, the candidates should be able to resist for a minute. The left bodyguard waved his hand and shouted that those who could stay conscious for a minute would pass the first challenge. He then announced the start. The leader of the Sound Clan ran her fingers along the strings. Her aura immediately filled the area. The energy reached the candidates, and some handled it worse than others. The protagonist was afraid of this power. People around him fell to the ground. Some were ill. Others complained of chest pain. The sound was audible even if you covered your ears. Then he looked at the fallen candidates and noticed that, as expected, those from the small clans had already lost consciousness. He admitted that in comparison, the representatives of the 6 clans and other children of the high-ranking clans were still holding up. Jack smiled and thought that it was just a tickle for his ears. Hannah plucked the strings again. Jack continued to smile. The candidates from the 6 clans had been taking medicine since they were children, which allowed them to build up enough Kai. He assumed that Ash, who had no Kai, was already lying on the ground. Hannah plucked the strings harder. The representatives of the 6 clans frowned. They felt something odd. The leader of the Sound clan continued. Maria, who could hardly bear the melody, noticed that Hannah's plucking was getting faster. The woman was releasing more and more energy, but it was unclear why. More and more candidates writhed in pain and covered their ears with their hands. Hannah looked ahead angrily, not understanding why he hadn't fallen yet. She really didn't like that Ash wasn't giving up. The protagonist looked at his hands, not really understanding himself. He saw that half of the people were already on the ground. The guy looked at them, assumed that they were suffering from internal injuries, and wondered why he himself was okay. Suddenly, Nano informed him that it had detected powerful high and low frequency waves coming from the instrument, and since there was a possibility of serious harm to the master's body, it had activated the emergency protection mode to block the influence of the sound waves. Ash realized that this mechanism made it so that he could not hear the sound waves. Nano confirmed that it had temporarily stopped the prince's body's ability to perceive sounds. The protagonist asked why he could then hear Nano's voice. The answer was that the information was sent directly to his brain. Ash admitted that it was tough. Hannah looked at him with a burning gaze. The guy broke out in a cold sweat. To him, the woman's eyes seemed simply huge. He asked Nano to block that terrifying gaze, and Nano offered to suspend his visual perception. Ash decided to be patient. Ben glanced at Hannah and felt the 5th elder starting to lose her patience. He became serious when he thought that the history of the Sound clan was much stronger than before. The man thought that such a level of energy should be too much for those with less than 20 years of Kai. As he expected, Ash was the reason for this. He had heard that this guy had no Kai, but now he doubted it because the protagonist was holding up extremely well. Ben smiled and admitted that this was the first time since he got his place at the academy that he had seen the first challenge go so excitingly. He wondered how long the fool could hold out. One of the candidates pointed out to another that his ears were bleeding, but the same could be said about him. The representatives of the elder clans tried to hold on, but not all of them succeeded. Even with 20 years of Kai, they were having a hard time, but they convinced themselves that they had to endure it a little longer because the clan's honor was at stake. Jack sat in the lotus position and had no problems, but he still didn't understand why the 5th elder was playing so hard. The representative of the Brook clan noticed that something was wrong with Hannah's expression. He assumed that she was angry. Jack turned around to check his sudden assumption. He was shocked. Romeo wondered why he was so surprised. Maria thought that they should not look behind those standing, but this was different. All 6 of them looked at Ash, who was standing visible after all the other candidates had collapsed. The representatives of the major clans were amazed that this fool without Kai managed to stay well, and besides, he was not tired at all. Ash himself did not understand how he deserved such attention. Jack clenched his teeth in anger. He realized with horror that this freak had Kai. The protagonist looked up and asked Nano if he was correct in thinking that the boys were ahead, and that the 5th elder was furious. The mechanism started examining the movements of the facial muscles. It detected confusion, surprise, annoyance, and anger from Hannah's muscle movements. Ash was shocked because his hearing was impaired. He didn't understand what was happening, but he could see their hostility. It was clear to the boy that their pride was wounded since they believed he had no Kai, and now they saw that he was still enduring. Everyone around him was bleeding from their ears. Ash knew that if he passed the first test in good shape, they wouldn't trust him if he said he had no Kai. He frowned, thought, and asked if Nano could cause him an internal injury. The guy clutched his stomach. The mechanism asked whether by internal injury he meant harm to his internal organs, and the protagonist confirmed. Nano verified that it was possible, but advised against it. The guy boldly continued to withstand the sound. He told the nanomachine that it didn't matter and urged it, as soon as the performance ended, to cause internal harm and make him spit blood. Then Nano accepted the master's command to damage internal organs. Hannah was angry, realizing that nearly a minute had passed. She looked at the kid who was not even 15 years old and couldn't believe that he endured it so easily. The head of the Sound clan bit her lip and decided that she couldn't leave it like this. She glanced at Ash from under her brows. Her pride didn't allow her to stop. Hannah began to play much stronger. She challenged the protagonist to withstand the performance, which would require half of her body's strength. Ben noticed that something was wrong and turned to Hannah, as it was risky. Romeo winced in pain. He had started bleeding. The left bodyguard tried to stop the fifth elder from making things worse. The head of the Sound Clan came to her senses and let go of the strings. The energy from the square instantly vanished. The candidate struggled to rise from the ground when it was finally over. Hank sat nearby with a flask. He noted that if Hannah had added a bit more power, everyone would have failed the first test. The right bodyguard couldn't believe that the fifth elder had lost control. Hannah sadly sat down on a chair and began to scold herself for what she had done. The woman realized that she hadn't been able to control her anger at the kid and had used half of her power. She clenched her teeth and decided that all this was because of the enemy of the 6 clans, because of Ash. The protagonist stood there, unmoving. He trembled slightly, then reached up to cover his mouth. The boy coughed up blood, causing both Ben and Hannah to notice him. Jack turned around, surprised as well. He honestly didn't grasp what was happening. The protagonist fell to his knees, still spitting up blood. The people around him began to worry. They thought he was dying since he was vomiting so much blood. Ash covered his mouth with his hand, holding back the blood. He was mad at Nano. The mechanism said that the program had been carried out as ordered. It explained that it had harmed 30% of the body's organs, causing maximum bleeding. The boy was still shaking. He mentally scolded Nano and called him a lunatic since he thought he was dying. Ash was struck again. He coughed up more blood. Ben suddenly jumped toward him. He tensed up because he was concerned about himself, because if the guy died because of the test, he would be accountable. The left bodyguard knew that Ash was not from the 6 clans, but he wasn't going to let a member of the leadership line die. He ran up to the protagonist, grabbed his hand, and asked if he was okay. Nano registered dizziness caused by the loss of 7% of blood and activated the self-healing mode of internal organs and blood supply, then shouted at the bleeding guy, but he couldn't answer yet. Ash went limp in the man's arms. The left bodyguard called him a fool who could just give up. The mechanism warned the master that he was in a dangerous state. The protagonist didn't move. He only asked Nano to heal him faster. Ben picked him up, felt his pulse, and wondered how much Kai he had since he had endured so much. The result shocked him. Then he looked at the protagonist, whose hand he held, in confusion when he found out that he had no Kai. He looked at Ash, covered in his own blood, and thought that he was truly insane. There were bad rumors about the 7th prince, but the man didn't expect much. Then he didn't know how to react to this. He couldn't believe that the protagonist passed the first test of only mental strength and willpower. The left bodyguard raised his palm and his subordinates instantly appeared. Then he glanced over his back at the 2 warriors and ordered them to carry him to the infirmary. The warriors accepted the order. The man continued to look at Ash, who was placed on a stretcher.